I'm Matt Jasa, and for today's episode of Glassmith, we'll be testing our luck with glass dice. Now you always want to start off your projects by cleaning the glass thoroughly with some isopropyl alcohol. And now I'll be using some white glass for the base of the die and then some black for the dots. And you'll notice with the black rods, they tend to react very quickly with the heat when it comes to that orange glow. So you'll be able to see the heat very quickly and know exactly how hot the rod is. So for the stringer pull, I want to make a nice band of heat before I pull it out. And you just want to see the same color orange all through that band. That will tell you that the temperature is the same. And then the faster you pull, the thinner the stringer will be, but the slower you pull, the thicker it will be. And we'll use the stringers for dots or lines. So it pretty much adds color to clear glass. You can kind of think of it as a thin pencil. Now I will punt it up to my white rod and start to gather it back into a sphere. You want to hold it mostly level as you rotate it, and sometimes you can hold it more at an upward angle if it starts to slump over when it gets too hot or flimsy. And as it gathers up that rod and gets larger, it'll want to slump off more. So you have to be a little bit more careful, or you could just punt it up on the opposite end and finish melting the rest of the rod in. When it comes to seeing the heat in the rod, the glow, whereas the black rod, it was easy, on the white rod, it's much harder. So to know how much heat you have in it for a stringer pull, for example, is kind of difficult to tell. And now that die that I had at the beginning of the video wasn't just for show. I'm actually using it to reference its size. And I've mentioned this before, when you're trying to replicate something in glass, it's always a good idea to have a picture next to you, or a little figurine, or in this case, the object itself. So in this case, I didn't have enough white glass. I'm going to go ahead and gather up a little bit more. And I'm going to also display the technique that I'm currently working on in the top right corner. And that way you can find your way through the video in case you're trying this project yourself and you want to relook at one of those techniques. You might have noticed that I always start on the end of the rod and work my way back. I'll show you why real quick. And you'll see when I begin to heat up that area, I start to lose stability really quickly. It begins to kind of flop down towards the floor and I have to rotate faster to counter that. And that's why I start on the end and melt it back. Now it's okay to push the glass back with the paddle to gather it up a little bit, but you want to make sure not to fold it over and trap any air inside the glass. And now white is a heat sensitive color, so if you do overheat it, it will start to boil and leave little bubbles in your glass. So to give it less heat, you want to put it out farther in the flame where it's cooler. And you'll notice I was doing that a lot more during the gathering process just because that thin rod will overheat quicker than a gather like this would. And I'll use the graphite pad and paddle to marver two sides at once. And marvering is a glass blowing term in which means to shape the glass on a surface. So as I've been marvering with my paddle, I've been holding it upright and bringing the glass down to it. And that's just because gravity will want to slump it, and it kind of helps to slump it into that paddle. I'll go ahead and attach a puntee, that way I can finish the other side. And then it'll leave a little bit of extra clear on there, which I don't want. So I'm going to come back in with that same rod and start picking it off. And the way that that's done is by leaving the rod a little bit cooler than the glass you're trying to pull off. If the rod's too hot, then it'll just end up melting back onto the piece. And then I'll go ahead and use my tweezers to get the rest of it off. You can tell that the clear is all off when you end up pulling it and you end up pulling a little bit of that color out. And the same thing would go for a colored puntee on clear glass. You would just keep pulling the colored glass off until you started to pull the clear glass off. And now here is the finished cube. I have one more step before I add the black dots to it. I'm going to heat up and gather up a bit of clear glass to attach some lenses to the sides. And then when I melt them in and flatten them out and turn it back into a cube, it will actually look like a concaved cube. Those sides will kind of come in a little bit. And then the idea is I'll place the black dots over those lenses, and then when the light comes in and hits those dots, it actually creates shadows inside the cube under the dots. As I'm melting the dot off, you'll see I swirled around to help break that connection faster, because if you just pull it away, you'll end up with a very long, thin stringer of clear glass. And one thing real quick, I have been calling them lenses, and it is kind of a lensing technique, but I am going to flatten it out completely, so at that point it won't be convexed, and technically it won't be a lens. So a better term would be windows. I'm going to melt down some windows on each side of the cube. And that's actually a pretty cool technique to do with marbles, because then instead of just looking from the top, you can look into the sides and get more of a view. And now you don't really need to marble these in like I'm doing here with the paddle. I was just kind of speeding it up and positioning the glass a little bit better. And I'll go ahead and attach another punty to work on the opposite end. It's good before attaching a punty to pull a little bit of glass off the end of it, just because there might be some bubbles or some debris on the surface, and you don't want to transfer that onto your project. And you can see it about halfway melted in right now. It also has a very nice orange glow from the heat. And working with the glass, I've always enjoyed seeing it molten and glowing like this. You know, it's almost like a little special light show that the glass blowers get to see. And then when you use multiple colors, you can actually see them all glowing because they glow at different shades of orange. It's really cool. Here you can really see it melted in there. It's starting to look like a concaved cube, like I was talking about before. And looking at that glow, you can tell the difference between the clear and the white. You know, it's never a uniform glow because the glasses are made of different materials. And it kind of affects how the light shines off of it. And you'll see what I'm talking about with the black too, as those dots will be very apparent on top of that clear. And I'll go ahead and attach a punty, that way I can finish up the opposite end. So basically I have 5 of the 6 sides shaped. So I'm going to go in and shape that last side. And as I melt this punty off, I'm not going to remove that extra glass there. I'll instead melt it in to make that last window. So I'll go ahead and grab that black stringer from the start of the video I pulled out and start laying down the dots. And one thing that can help is to prop your arms or wrists against a solid object. And that will help stabilize your hands to keep them from shaking. Now I think I had a little bit too much coffee today. These dots didn't turn out exactly like I wanted. And you can try to move them a little bit with a paddle or tweezers before you melt them in. But once you place them, it's already a little bit too late for that. I'll zoom in the camera to get a better view. So then I heat the tip of the rod till it's molten, and I heat the surface of the area I'm going to attach to just a little bit, and then push in to that surface. And I found it's a bit easier to melt in one side of dots at a time, rather than trying to place all your dots and then melt the entire cube in. Now I did the windows a little bit differently. I placed all my windows first and then melted all of them in at the same time. And I'm not going to use the paddle to push the dots in, but I'll melt them completely in with the flame. And that will actually change the characteristic of how it looks in the end. It'll have more depth in the glass instead of being spread out. But I will have to use the paddle to flatten the sides again, just because as you melt those dots in, the molten glass wants to come out more convex, like a lens or a sphere. So I have to return it back into that cube shape. And here I'm placing the 5 dots, and I'm making a little bit of adjustments, kind of adding a little bit of glass here and there. And then to do that, you want to heat up the rod just a little bit more than the dot you're trying to add the glass to. If they're both the same temperature, you'll end up just pulling that dot out and you'll actually lose glass on it. And here's a shot of those dots, what they look like before I melt them in. So I'll go ahead and finish melting those dots in, and then I'll attach a putty again to work on the opposite side. Now there's a black dot at the spot that I want to putty up to, so I'll just use a black rod. That way when I break off the putty later, I can just melt in that remaining glass without having to remove any. By looking at those black dots, you can actually tell the gradient of heat very easily. Those brighter dots means it's a lot hotter in that area. And the white and the clear glass is all kind of a uniform orange. It's not actually showing us how hot it is. Now, if you're planning to work pendants, marbles, beads, a lot of decorative items, then you really do want to practice your dots, your dot placement. And so this project is a pretty good one to practice if you're getting into glass blowing. I would probably do it after you've done a couple marbles, maybe a couple pendants. But a small project like this, you wouldn't need a kiln for. You can just bench cool it. And here it is. It's looking really cool. I'm impressed of how it turned out. But the effect I love is how those dots are casting shadows inside the die. And as I move the light around, you'll see those shadows moving. And that's exactly why I designed it with those windows on each side, because I've done it before without it, and it looked too much like a normal die where it wasn't very impressive. But by looking at this one, you can really tell it's a glass die, not just a plastic one. And so I'll go ahead and test my luck here. I'll roll it 100 times and tally down each side I get, and by that I'll know how balanced it is. This is how you can test your dice at home. And according to the law of large numbers, the more you run this test, the better the results will be. So you'll know more accurately how off your die is. Oh, and I forgot to mention this before, but there's actually a standard method of placing the dots on the die. They're not just on there randomly. And basically, opposite sides will equal out to however many sides there are on the die plus 1. So for a 6-sided die, that would be 7, 6 plus 1. And so then if you look at the number 6 on your die, flip it around to the opposite side and you'll find the 1. If you look at the 4 flipped around, you'll find the 3, and look at the 5 flipped around, you'll find the 2. So here are the results, and it's looking pretty even except for the 2 and the 4. One of the sides might just be a little convexed. That would be an easy fix. That's the cool thing about glass, is that you can keep reheating it again and again. So if you need to rework a project, or if you break something and you want to make a repair, you can just go in and do it. It just takes a little time. And that should do it for this episode of Glassmith. Thank you for watching. My name's Matt Jasa, and remember, have a great day.